Welcome to Mysterious Universe, Season 23, Episode 22. Coming up on the show, we've got the Flash Crash Savant, the Monastery Snakes of Immortality, and how to keep your money printing machine hidden from your parents. I'm Benjamin Grundy. Joining me is Aaron Wright.
I'm imagining that you want to keep your money printing machine hidden from everyone, not just your parents.
Yes, especially the government and the tax office. You wouldn't want to tell anyone that you've got a money printing machine. But this is really what happened. I was sucked into this book. It's by Liam Vaughan. It's a brand new one, just came out. And Vaughan has been a financial reporter for years. He writes for Bloomberg, but he's been investigating white-collar crimes on Wall Street and how some of these big financial firms use their tricks to kind of rig the game.
Oh, and there's so many as well. I mean, you see it happening in Australia all the time, except somehow they just seem to skirt the law a little bit and they're able to do it.
Well, this one's called Flash Crash, a trading savant, a global manhunt, and the most mysterious market crash in history. And it goes back to 2010. I think it was about midway through 2010 when there was this really mysterious market crash, but it just affected the whole world, like the whole global financial system for about 30 minutes just completely imploded. It had traders, it had traders just like jaw on the ground, staring at their screens, wondering, this is the end of the world. This is the end of the world. And for some unexplained miraculous reason, it was a flash crash. It just came right down, huge losses across the board. Some stocks were worth $50 and they're trading for 0.00001 cents.
Oh,
and other weird things were happening, like Apple stock was trading for $100,000 a piece. Like, it was just mayhem. No one understood what was going on. Algorithms were going crazy. Machines were trading with each other and no one knew what was going on.
Had someone hacked the exchange?
No one knew. It was a massive mystery, but just as it was all happening and people thought, this is it, this is the end of the world,
Armageddon.
Like this is the end of the financial system, it all started to come back. And it was mostly the machines trading with each other that got everything back to normal. And by the end of the day, the flash crash had lasted half an hour and it was a bad day, but it wasn't crazy. Like the market was down 2 points or something. And immediately after, you just had like the US Treasury Secretary, you had like the head of the World Bank, all the major financial guys in one room just going, what the fuck just happened?
That's incredible.
And this is the amazing story. I can't wait to tell you some of this story. It comes down to this kid.
It always does, doesn't it?
In England.
Yeah.
In his parents' house.
Yep.
It's crazy.
It's just like, it's almost the equivalent of, it was the Bulgarian kid that created a nuclear reactor in his parents' garage. It's always some just seemingly like savant style kid that creates something incredible. So obviously, did this guy end up having a great career?
Well, I'll tell you some of the story. It's a fantastic mystery. And I just want to introduce the story to you later on the show and we'll tell some of that. But I've been looking forward to your stuff coming up because, you mentioned some of it on the Last Plus show. You've been back into the Stonehill archives. There's some kind of strange, mysterious group in Russia that's had their files exposed. What's going on there?
Yeah, it's really, really odd. So Paul Stonehill has a YouTube channel. I'll link to it in the show notes so you can check it out for yourself. I mean, he's been on the show a couple of times. We've covered some of his books. And the guy is just a really great all-round researcher. Some of the stuff that he uncovers does defy kind of the limits of believability.
When I think of Paul Stonehill, I think of old Soviet stories of people coming across blob creatures in the snow.
Well, that's kind of the things that he does uncover.
Weird stuff like that.
Yeah, he really does. He really does uncover, the height of strangeness. And in fact, some of the stuff I was looking into today, it was like, and I didn't end up going into it, but he was talking about some of the strange mysteries that come out of Mongolia. And that's going to be part of this immortality thing that I'm going to be talking about in a moment. But one thing he was describing was this gigantic bear that seemed to be roaming around in Mongolia.
What?
And yeah, it was massive. It was a massive, gigantic bear. And
like a bear god.
Yeah, kind of. And it had been in, apparently, the folklore of the local tribes people for generations. And it had moved through, and no one believed it except for when you started having foreign explorers moving into Mongolia, I mean, you had people being sent from France in the 13th and 14th century into these regions to do exploring. They were coming back with reports of these gigantic bears.
So it's meant to be some kind of undiscovered species.
Yeah, which unfortunately we don't have any confirmation of. But the reason why I like the work that Paul puts together is because what it is, I mean, the Soviet Union itself, because of the way that the government was established, the society was, it was about suppression of everything. Like, everything was completely suppressed, and it was only when the Iron Curtain fell that information started trickling out very slowly, these details about UFO encounters. I mean, there's so many UFO encounters, which is one of Paul's books that he goes into. But it's the high strangeness, it's the extreme examples that I really like and what I want to talk about. So one thing I was looking at recently, and this is what we were talking about on the Plus section of the show, is we were talking about what seemed to be strange experiences with time dilations, time anomalies that are coming out from these Russian reports. And when I say that they're relatively modern, we're talking the 1950s, 1960s, stuff that was at the time policed and suppressed. People were threatened that were involved in it, and then it only came out after the fall of this Iron Curtain.
Right.
So there is this mysterious research organization that I want to actually do some of my own research into and find out more details about them. Because what it appears to be at the moment for me is that I can't tell whether or not they're a MUFON-style organization, that they're legitimate and that they are out in the open and they're, freely expressing and exchanging ideas and taking in information, or if there's some secretive group that is trying to subversively, or was subversively, trying to get details about these experiences out to the West.
Are they from the Soviet era?
They are, yeah. They were around in the Soviet time, but they've still existed up until recently as far as I can tell.
What's it called?
It's called the Phenomenon Institute. But Paul says that's the English translation of their name.
You should have just called them the Institute.
Yeah,
That'd
the Institute.
be way more mysterious.
Well, what's funny, though, is that there seems to be a history, though, of similar types of organizations that exist underneath, oppressive regimes, whether it's communist or socialist. I mean, I've seen stuff like this, and I will do more research into this. My uncle actually was talking to me about a friend of his who was Yugoslavian. And he was involved in, it was a horrible experience for him because it was under socialist, control. And he said you couldn't go into the pub and talk about things because
freedom, yeah.
Yeah, because he's like, you can go have a drink, but if you say something that goes against the state, your friend will dob you in.
Yeah.
But he was describing to my uncle, he's like, there were very strange experiences that happened in Yugoslavia, UFO experiences, high strangeness experience, alleged crashes of things, meteorites coming down that would actually not behave like meteorites. And there was a group, he claimed, that was essentially policing the phenomenon. And so what it would do is it would come and seek out any information about what was happening with these experiences that people were just talking about, and people would disappear. And it was really strange because it would be a UFO report, something that you and I and most people around the world today would just readily report. But these people would report a UFO experience to their friend or their neighbor, they'd get dobbed in and they would just disappear, which is just strange. I just don't understand. The same thing came out of some research that I was looking into, which I couldn't actually go into any more detail, but it was about the Romanian Unit Zero. Have you heard about the Romanian Unit Zero?
It rings a bell. Is this from the series of books that have come out from, what's his name? There's a bunch of translations from Romania, and they're the Transylvanian series.
That's exactly right.
I tried reading them. It was only recently, actually, a few months ago, because the setup for the story is crazy. I think I started telling it on the show where a baby was born and his umbilical cord was made of metal or something, and he was some kind of superhuman.
Yeah, it's called Transylvanian Sunrise. It's by Radu Cinema with Peter Moon.
That's right.
And you're right. The reason why this story starts out really fascinatingly is because it describes this man that was born amongst, underneath this oppressive regime. And he was dobbed in the moment he was born to the authorities because when the doctor went to go and cut the umbilical cord, they couldn't cut it. And as you said, they couldn't cut the cord because it seemed to be metallic.
Yeah.
They couldn't. And so obviously...
And then soon after, these men in suits from the KGB turn up on their doorstep. Right?
Allegedly from this group known as Unit Zero.
Right.
And so what Unit Zero is very similar to what I was describing about, these allegations. Obviously, there's no way to prove it about this group that was policing the paranormal in Yugoslavia. It was exactly the same. This Unit Zero group was tasked with monitoring any type of activity like this and then going and investigating it and collecting information about it. And one of the things that came up with this Sadhu Ra, not Sadhu Ra, Radu Cinema.
Yeah, that's why I couldn't remember his name, dude. It's insane. You know, with the people that show up, though, they also had this weird Chinese scientist with him.
Oh, that's right.
He would kind of follow them, and it's like he had all this authority, this Chinese scientist, and he had these like qigong powers. It's such a wild story.
Oh, look, it's a wild story because essentially it seems that throughout the crux of the stories, it doesn't just relate to this guy that apparently had a metallic umbilical cord. It was also the fact that Unit Zero had been established because there had been an ancient civilization, a group of people that had existed in the Romanian era.
That's
in the
right.
area, sorry.
The child that was born eventually became one of the top people in Unit Zero.
That's correct.
Right?
And that's why some of this information allegedly has come out. And you're absolutely right, Ben. I probably will try and dig through this a little bit more later on because I tried to do it in the last couple of days and it's
impenetrable.
It's almost impenetrable because the way that the translation goes, it's a very poor translation. But what allegedly was happening is that Romanian scholars were pulling out information about ancient Atlantis being coded into ruins all throughout Romania. And so this Unit Zero was going and looking into these ruins and trying to match the details about this ancient group. And from what I can tell, they found this group known as the Dacians. And the Dacians were this very advanced civilization. And they had built, allegedly, a Romanian Sphinx as being the central kind of location where they had their information stored.
Where the records were stored under the Sphinx.
And so this group, as recently as August of 2008, was trying to go and find these records, and apparently it was under the Busey, I'm sorry if I got that wrong, mountains, and it was connected into somehow back to Transylvania. So this is why this is called Transylvanian Sunrise.
Yeah, he's pumping out these books. New ones are coming out all the time.
Yeah.
What's his name again? Babu Cinnabon?
Radu Cinema, not
right.
Cinnabon. So, it's an incredible, strange story. But the reason why I wanted to mention it, despite it being very difficult to kind of translate it, because you're right, Ben, the reference to this Chinese or this Asian doctor was Dr. Zien. And Dr. Zien was this he seemed to always be an innocent bystander. But he had details exactly of what was going on inside these mountains. And
it's like when he first saw the child, he just went up to the child and stared deep into his eyes and was like, I know what this is.
Yeah. Yeah. So allegedly, apart from dealing with individuals with mysterious powers, Department Zero would deal with all sorts of anomalous and psychic phenomena that would appear anywhere in the country. They apparently had a department that was connected to any type of authority organization, and they would monitor these channels and they would deploy to a location whenever something was reported. And it ultimately ended up that one of these people was pretty much left alone in the department to try and, and put all this information together and work things out. And this is where stuff started leaking out. It was like this spiritual kind of transformation he had by being exposed to this kind of stuff. But then it ultimately comes down in the end to this battle, because he had superior abilities, but then the department didn't want him to utilize the abilities, and he ended up training himself because while he was getting the information, some of that information gave details on how to acquire superhuman abilities.
Yeah, that's what is so ridiculous about it, is he's this superhuman guy with all these amazing abilities, but we have to learn about him through all these other third-hand sources.
That's right. And there's details in there that allegedly he managed to somehow access or seem to be able to pass through a parallel universe. Yeah. And, just the most extreme and outrageous.
Yeah, that's why I started reading it. It looked like fun.
Yeah, exactly.
But it was, hard to make sense of.
I think it's a really good adventure type style.
How does this link to your Russian stuff, though?
So the reason why I'm mentioning this is because I'm just simply pointing out that regardless of this being like a crazy kind of story, it's consistent with exactly what Paul was talking about that was happening in Soviet times. It seems that in Soviet times, there was the equivalent of a Department Zero, a special section of the KGB or of the secret police or even the organizations that predated the KGB.
It's like a Soviet MJ-12.
That's exactly right, that were specially selected to monitor any type of anomalous phenomena that was taking place anywhere connected with the Soviet Union. And, it kind of makes sense in a way. It makes sense to me because as much as I think the same reason why the US and Australia and the Allies never released information about it is because if you can investigate it and this seems to be superhuman or it seems to be supernatural, if you can weaponize it and control it, that's a good advantage to have. So I understand why these things are all kept secret and hush-hush, but it is fun and it is wonderful that this information is slowly, getting out there. So this is what Paul has done. So I was going through one of the videos that he's put up and descriptions about time, essentially. And there seemed to be a group of people connected to this group that was specifically targeting time anomalies. And anyone who passed through a time anomaly was collected by this group, and this group made everyone else shut up. Men in Black style would come in and do this. So some of the earliest reports, though, go all the way back to the spring of 1571, and this related to the Crimean Khans. So the Crimean Khans actually marched on Moscow. It was one of the largest battles of the time. It was, this firefight, and even though it wasn't a firefight, but it was this massive battle where I think it was 80 to 120,000 people died.
Wow.
It was this massive battle. But as I said, it was 1571. But what was odd is some type of temporal spatial event took place.
What?
And one detachment of Khans allegedly got caught in some type of cloud.
Where's this information from? Why would we have known about this historic battle with a time anomaly?
This is the thing. So what happened is that they were captured by obviously the Tsar's soldiers.
Yeah.
And when they were talking to these Khans, they actually weren't Khans. And they were all confused because they thought that they were from 1621.
Oh, I have heard this story
They
before.
were from 1621.
Yeah.
So what they had done, and this is this detail that keeps on popping up, which is consistent with what we hear of many of these stories about time anomalies and time slips, is that they claim that they'd driven their horses deep into this ravine, and this ravine was enveloped in a strange fog and a mist. When they came out of that fog and mist, they found themselves on this battlefield where they were captured by the Tsar. The Tsar's soldiers. But of course, 1571 to 1621, it's not a huge time gap, and especially back then, if we were teleported 50 years into the future or into the past, you would definitely notice. You would know a big difference. But back then, things would be odd, but it wouldn't be that significantly different. But it really was. As soon as they were captured and they started reporting these details and talking to the Tsar, this is how they worked out, allegedly, that they were from 1621. Now, I don't know what happened to them. I don't know if they dematerialized.
Did they fade away?
Well, that's
like Back to the Future?
Exactly. But this is one thing that we were talking about on the Plus extension, or on the Plus show, I'm sorry, is that some of these experiences that people have. So there was this story of a psychiatric facility that was dealing with people, obviously, were suffering from emotional and mental distress. And this doctor was reporting back to authorities about patients he'd been dealing with. And one particular patient came in being diagnosed with schizophrenia. And it turns out, and go back and listen to that show if you want to find out the full details of the story, but the crux of the story is that they worked out that this guy had wandered in from a different time. He wasn't of that time. He wasn't schizophrenic. He didn't appear to be schizophrenic. He actually seemed to be like someone of very sound mind, but he was in his wrong time. He'd been flung into the wrong time. Now, no one really believed him still, even though he seemed to be quite sane. And sometimes people suffering from schizophrenia can go through phases where they do come out and seem to be quite normal. But in this doctor's experience, he's never seen anything like this before. They locked him in a room, obviously a safe room. He disappeared from the locked room. There was no way that anyone could have done it. And couldn't have removed him. And what has been suggested is that people that get out of their time for whatever reason through passing through these anomalies, it's almost like a rubber band being stretched, and all of a sudden, and you go flying back to wherever you're supposed to go.
You told a bit of this on the last show, and someone pointed out you were describing the plot to 12 Monkeys, and whoever disappeared was Bruce Willis.
It kind of, you know what though, it kind of is that way. That happens,
but that's where the writer for 12 Monkeys got the story.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah, exactly. Well, maybe. I mean, it's just funny, and the reason why that story was really intriguing is because that particular facility had a lot of these similar types of stories that started popping out. And it could have been like, well, how is it that everyone that is suffering from schizophrenia or another similar schizoid kind of affective disorder or start describing that they're out of time.
There was another one where this Russian soldier, he ended up going back in time to his parents' high school, and he had to make sure that his mother and his father got together so that his existence wouldn't be erased.
It's like, niet. No, nothing like that at all. So, continuing though with these strange stories that were pulled up, the other thing that comes, and you may know the story quite well, so I won't go into too much detail, but I just want to utilize it to emphasize that there's a long history of this kind of stuff occurring. I mean, yeah, we're going back to 1571, but there was also the Russian Empress Catherine II. Now, Catherine II ended up having a man brought to her. And the reason why this man was brought to her is because he appeared suddenly in the street. It doesn't say how he appeared, and I don't know if they're suggesting that he simply materialized onto the street or if that he just started wandering into the street. But he wandered into the street claiming that he was from the future. And he started ranting and raving about being from the future. Again, this could be a madman. But
so the first guard that comes across this crazy person is like, I know what'll push my career to the top. Yeah. I'm going to take this person to the queen.
You have to remember hierarchical structures back in those times. I think it's possible that if you had someone that extreme show up and start describing these events, because he wasn't just saying he was from the future, he was describing events in great detail. In great detail. So they took him eventually to her. It wasn't that, he had just immediately been taken to her. It seemed like he passed up through a group of people.
Gotcha.
And eventually when he got to her, he described what was going to happen. He described the Napoleonic invasion of Russia at the time. He told her about the date of her death. He told her about numerous other terrible atrocities that were going to take place. And she was horrified. She was absolutely horrified, and she kicked him out of the kingdom. He wasn't
just a seer? He definitely claimed he was from the future.
He claimed he was from the future. He claimed that he was tilling a field, and all of a sudden he fell down and found himself, and when he stood back up, he found himself standing in the middle of this street, which obviously is an ancient street. Well, not ancient, but it's an old street in comparison to now. But he finds himself in this location. She kicked him out, and then he disappeared. Another one of these people seemingly snapped back in time for whatever reason, unless he was just some crazy nutter. But according to the legends and according to the stories, those are the things that he said were recorded. They were recorded at the time. And the incredible thing is that those things took place on the dates that he had described. So there's validation. So unless this guy was an incredible seer, the other option seems to be...
So you're saying they wrote down his claims?
His claims.
How long before the events? Like 100 years before the events?
Oh, it was less than that. It was probably, 50 to, maybe less, 50 to 25 years in that range. And then all of a sudden these events took place. So now the sad thing about this is that even though they are in legends and allegedly recorded, it's still hotly debated. It's hotly debated.
Well,
now.
It's all in Russian, and only Paul has access to the story.
No, it's not, because it's not. I think you give Paul a bit of a hard time because these things are actually documented by other researchers. The only thing is that Paul is the one who is doing a great job in bringing it to English-speaking audiences. I did notice, and I'm sorry I haven't replied to your email yet, but somebody, I think it was Mariana, I'm sorry if I got your name wrong, but she emailed in. She says she speaks Russian, so I'm going to try and pull out some of these Russian documents and see if I can get some translations out of them and find more of these details, because they're really, it's a shame that, and I'm not giving Paul a hard time, but it's a shame that Paul is our only link to this stuff at the moment. I think, if we can actually find more people that speak Russian.
Had another source that could verify where it's coming from.
Yeah, and pull out these details, because, there are so many of these wonderful stories. And it doesn't just apply to Russia. I think it's obviously with Eastern Europe as well, from what I was just saying about the allegations about Yugoslavia. There's probably ancient German stuff as well that we could go through. But at the moment, we're just stuck with the great research of Paul. But let's skip forward. Let's move forward to the allegations of these time cops, this detachment that was being utilized by the KGB. And we come to this story of Winter from 1942. Now, many of the time slip stories that I've described on the show in the past, and some of the things that I've referenced from Paul, it seems to be that the time anomaly is associated with a region. And this is something that Paul points out. It's like ravines seem to be really common. It's a strange thing. But there's so many reports of people heading down into ravines and then coming out. And when they come out, they find that there's years missing, that they have seemingly been teleported through this ravine. So it's the geography of the location that activates the time slip. But that's not just it. There has to be other factors going on here, and perhaps there are psychophysiological or psycho-emotional effects that are taking place. And this relates to a story that comes from, it was, as I said, winter of 1942. there were 6 Soviet guerrilla fighters. They were deployed to capture this German officer. And the reason why they needed to get this German officer is because their intelligence had told them that he had very important documents that had the possibility to actually change the course of the war. So they were deployed to the Minsk Highway, and if they could get these documents, it would be a great turn for the Russian army. It would be really wonderful. So what happened is that they knew, though, these Russian fighters, these guerrilla fighters, they were really dedicated. But the problem is that this was basically a death sentence. They might be able to get one of them out, even though there were 6 of them. They knew that probably most of them were going to die and only one would get out. And this is the decision they had to make. Now, regardless of however, trained you are and, however honed you are, you still get fear. You still experience fear. Your emotional state, even though you're in control of it as a trained soldier, would still be heightened. Paul seems to think that this played a factor in what occurred, because that evening, when they were waiting to ambush this German officer who was coming through with his motorcade, they claimed that despite the fact that it was dark, all of a sudden this bright light lit up out of nowhere over the top of them. It was like it spread out from the center, and it was like a mushroom that came flying over the top of them. And it was blindingly bright, but they could still see. And so they're looking around, and they say that as they look up, they see all of a sudden this light tunnel settle upon the highway, like this tunnel come down and sit on the highway. And as they watch with their jaws agape and trying to understand what they're experiencing and comprehend what they're seeing before their very eyes, they claim that they suddenly see trucks, buses, and cars driving out of this tunnel onto this road. They were noiseless. There was just no noise coming from it. And they also noticed that the Oz factor was kicking in because there was no noise around them either. It was just this scene that was playing out before their eyes. But they said that they noticed a glazed box emerge from this tunnel.
What? A glazed box? Like honey glaze? Sugar glaze?
Well, no, as in glass. It was a modern bus. So buses now, so back then, buses weren't all glass. Buses were mostly metal, and you'd have the windows in them. Now modern buses have these large glass windows. I mean, if you look at a bus here in Australia, it's a big glass thing. That's exactly what they saw. So these soldiers, they said this thing lasted for 3 to 4 minutes. And one thing that they saw is what they thought was an ambulance emerge. And of course, ambulances are transtemporal. You can see them, you can tell what if you look at an ambulance from the 1940s,
yeah,
no, it's an ambulance. Yeah. So this white thing, though, emerges, and it's got the red cross on it, and they realize that it's an ambulance, but it's a type of vehicle that they've never seen before. It appears to be this ultra-modern vehicle. Now, as they're watching for 3 to 4 minutes, all of a sudden the light ends and the event's over. Now,
the vehicles disappear?
Vehicles disappear, the lights go, nothing happens. But they're also, you got to remember, they're on a highway that continued to exist 30 years later. And what they find out 30 years later, that ambulance that they saw, so these soldiers reported this. So this is why we have this information. 30 years later, one of those soldiers came out, and he said only recently the reason why he came out and told his story was because he saw this brand new Volga-type van appear on the market. This brand new Volga-type van was the vehicle, the ambulance that he saw 30 years prior when this tunnel opened up.
Gotcha.
So to see this kind of stuff, I mean, if it was just one person, you can say, well, he was probably either hallucinating because he was having a psychological breakdown, but not 6. Not 6 of them to see all this thing. And they all reported this, and they all reported their state. Now, perhaps this tunnel wouldn't have opened either if it was just 1 or 2 people. But it seems to be that, like with the Philip experiment, when we did the Philip experiment, Ben, nothing was happening, but all that emotion that seemed to kick in when we were laughing and joking, and all of a sudden this table starts moving around the room from this psychokinetic energy that seems to be coming from people. It may be the same type of thing. This energy that comes from people's emotions might be able, and we know in poltergeist cases, that's some suspicion as well, that poltergeists are responsible from people's psychokinetic abilities.
It's a theory.
It's a theory, exactly. But it may also be what explains what's going on here. It could have been a combination of things. It could have been that this area was inclined to have temporal events and their emotions open. We just simply don't know. But these stories are great because they're recorded in the annals of these historic records from the military. So when we come back, we're going to go into more strange appearances of people that have shown up frozen after seemingly passing through time.
It's Xenoman.
And we are also going to find out about the monastic snakes of immortality in the Mongolian mountains. You're listening to Mysterious Universe. Don't go away. back listening to Mysterious Universe, and we are currently discussing time slips, and I'm soon going to go into immortality as well. I have a really strange tale that comes out from a fascinating Russian researcher. But before we go into that, I just wanted to finish off this section that I was talking about this being possible time cops that have been established within the KGB. And the reason why I talk about it is because it relates to two significant experiences that occurred near Sevastopol in Crimea. So this is a city that's on the Black Sea, and already it's got a lot of apparently high strangeness associated with it. It seems to be one of these areas that has, strange things happen. But there's an incident that happened at the end of the 1980s that happened just off the coast. It was apparently in the Pacific Ocean, but they were based out of this Sevastopol. And there was an unidentified craft that appeared before this Soviet submarine. Now, the Soviet submarine was just going about doing its standard routine, and they came across this craft. Now, at first, they weren't sure what it was, but when they got closer to it, they realized that it was some type of large lifeboat or a rescue boat of some kind. So they surfaced, and they went to pull in the rescue boat. And when they pulled the boat in, they find a half frostbitten man in a Japanese uniform from the Second World War. Now, this is at the end of the 1980s. How is it that, I know that it's off Russia, so Japan isn't technically that far away, but still.
What's he doing there?
And how come he's frostbitten and he's in a Japanese uniform, and he's only speaking Japanese?
Are you sure he wasn't encased in a giant ice cube? With a mammoth next to him?
I'm sure of that. And I'm more than aware of, the Back to the Future stories of, like where the time machine travels through time, it's freezing. So I know that there's a possibility of, that influencing such stories. But this is allegedly coming from these declassified reports that have been pulled out from Russia. So they went through his pockets, and they actually found that he had a Second World War ID card on him. It was from 1940. He was taken aboard the submarine. They took him back to port. When they got back to port, there were already strange GRU counterintelligence officers. So GRU was kind of like the precursor to the KGB, that were waiting at the pier to take this man into custody.
Hang on a second. You're saying he's not a corpse?
He's alive.
He's alive?
He's alive. He's frostbitten. His fingers and his extremities.
Can he talk?
Yeah, he talks, but he speaks Japanese.
What does he say?
We don't know.
Oh, no.
No, probably not quite that. But maybe you're right. He has no idea. And of course you wouldn't. He has no idea what's going on. All we find out about this story is that he described that immediately he starts saying something like he was giving respect to Stalin. So it's like this kind of surrender thing. But that's what Japanese troops would have done at the time if they were captured by the Russians or captured by the Allies. So
hang on. No, they wouldn't submit themselves to Stalin. That's absurd. They would commit suicide. They wouldn't let themselves be captured. They were radical, servants of their emperor.
Yeah, of course, some of them were, but some of them, were smarter than that, not wanting to commit suicide, and would be like, well, it's better than die. The poor guy's been floating in a time anomaly for the past 50 years or 30 years. What's he supposed to do?
Suck it up and retain his honor.
So the reason why this story came out is because allegedly the captain that was involved in this was so disturbed by the experience, because obviously it's a time anomaly and you can't make out what's occurring. But he was threatened by these counterintelligence officers never to talk about it. But after 30 years had passed, he finally went, you know what? I'm going to describe this. Apparently, he described it to his daughter just before he died, and his daughter is the one who got all the information out.
So we don't know what happened to this guy, obviously.
We don't know what happened to him, but what we find out later on is that this is a group that seems to be, they know when these things happen, or at least they are there as soon as they're reported. They're on the cutting edge of these reports, and they pull them in and they take them to some facility, and whatever that facility is, we just simply don't know. So still in this same city, in this same region, there was another captain of a ship that encountered a temporal anomaly in the bay, and this happened in the summer of 1989. So around the same time as well. And there was a warship that was part of the Black Sea Fleet, and it was anchored. And as it was anchored, obviously there's watchmen around, and it's still a Cold War. There's obviously a heightened sense of security that's happening. And one of the sailors that was on board this boat, he said he looked down and he noticed that there were bubbles breaking the surface of the water that was coming closer and closer to the ship that he was standing on. So immediately he rings the alarm, because it could be a saboteur. This is what happens, right? And they pull this guy out of the water, and when they pull him out of the water, they find that it's a German diver. and he's from World War II. And the first thing that he says, much like the Japanese guy, is Hitler kaputt. That's all he can say. He speaks German and he says Hitler kaputt. But what that means is that's what the Germans would do when they would surrender themselves to the Nazis.
What's kaput mean?
Not
Hitler's
the Nazis.
dead?
Yeah, no. It's like because he doesn't speak Russian, that he would just give up. Like he's saying Hitler kaput, like I don't have any interest in Hitler anymore. I'm, surrendering myself to the Russians, not the Nazis, I'm sorry. So that happens, but the guy, so obviously there was no coldness or anything like that. But the guy claimed, because he spoke in broken Russian, and there were eventually, a German-speaking translator comes aboard who was on the vessel.
Right.
But he describes that it's 1943. He's convinced. He's like, I'm here to place a mine in the bay. I was coming to your vessel. I have no idea what's going on. And of course, immediately, these counter-intel military officers from the GRU or from some group show up.
The Institute people turn up.
The Institute people show up and immediately they arrest him or take him into custody for whatever purpose. Now, the ship's captain was actually sent to headquarters that moment. Like he was off the vessel and sent. He was told to keep quiet about the incident, to never talk about it. And eventually he finally does come out with these details. And this is how we have this story. But it doesn't end there, because there are other events that have taken place as well that, who knows if there was something about that bay that was causing these time anomalies to take place. Could also be, yet again, it's wartime. These are both soldiers that have heightened emotions that are going on. Maybe that has activated some type of time anomaly or a portal or distortion or a rip in space-time. I don't know. But the other events that take place, there are allegedly other ways to create rips in time. And this might give us some insight into why the extraterrestrials, or at least the contactee era extraterrestrials that many people were dealing with, were warning us about nuclear weapons. They were warning us about the destruction of humanity. It wasn't about nuclear weapons physically destroying the planet. It was about causing rips in space-time that could destabilize time itself and could cause all these problems. And the reason why I suggest that is because there's a story that comes from the Polygon. So the Polygon, Ben, if you're not aware, and I wasn't, but perhaps some people will know, the Polygon was the primary testing site in Soviet Russia or in the USSR in, I think it's Kazakhstan. It was, it's 150 kilometers from Semi on the east Kazakhstan border, but it was their primary nuclear weapons testing site from 1949 to 1989. Highly secretive. 456 underground nuclear tests took place there. The full impact of the radiation exposure was kept secret, and it caused so many problems because obviously you're exploding hundreds of nuclear bombs, as I said, 456. It closed in 1991, but from 1996 to 2012, there was actually this secret program to recover plutonium from the tunnels that were left in there. So really, dangerous environmental things had taken place. But we get this story that comes from an Ivanov Mikhailovich, and it relates to an event that took place somewhere. We don't have an exact date, but an event that took place during a nuclear weapons test in either 1960s or the 1970s. So what we know about this story is that what they would do is they would drill deep, deep, deep into the ground, and there would be this well that would be placed in. But obviously the well would be covered up before the weapon would be detonated and tested. But at the well, you could place yourself, over the top of the well, and you wouldn't be affected by it. And scientists would be there because they would be measuring, instruments like seismographs and other scientific instruments, to see exactly what was happening with the explosion. Now, allegedly, nothing strange had happened except for this particular event. 3 scientists came forward and said that when one of the explosion tests was being conducted, this test was conducted at a depth of 3 kilometers. The explosion took place, but this scientist claimed that all of a sudden when the explosion took place, he heard a very heavy sigh kind of noise.
Where?
That's just all around him. That's the only way you could describe it. There were 2 other scientists standing with him, but he said when this happened, he said the room below him fell away. But it wasn't that the room had collapsed or that the bomb had somehow collapsed the building beneath him. It was like some weird temporal anomaly where the room had just gone and disappeared. He said he then found himself standing on the floor above, And the two other scientists were on the other sides of him, were actually outside on a cliff and another in a ravine.
What the hell is going on?
It caused like some type of rip in space-time that teleported these three scientists in different directions.
Oh my gosh.
Now, he claims that all of a sudden then the floor wobbled like jelly. It shuddered. He said some door slammed shut on this other dimension that seemed to be opening. And he said something lifted me. And then he found himself standing back in the room with the two other scientists looking shocked.
And the other scientists had the same experience?
The same experience. They found them one outside, one in a ravine. Odd. Very, very, very odd. And this is something
They're on a mountain.
I don't know what this is. I mean, is this some type of, is it just simply the power of the explosion is enough to rip a hole in space-time? Is that why the extraterrestrials were that concerned about using nuclear weapons? Is it because we don't actually do nuclear testing anymore? It's all done through, computers
simulations,
simulations and modeling. Maybe the extraterrestrials like, well, once they've switched over to that, as long as they don't set off any nuclear weapons, everything should be okay. But, there's other stories that come out as well. And I think I've briefly mentioned this story before, Ben, but I'll just add it here because it puts a nice cherry on top of this group that seems to be looking for this. There's two things that happened. One is that in Soviet Georgia, there was a tornado that tore through this town. And when the tornado tore through the town, what was odd is that every single home that was damaged by the tornado, their clocks were ahead by 8 minutes. Every single home where this tornado had hit. So it was almost like the natural phenomenon had caused some type of temporal distortion that had pushed clocks 8 minutes forward.
I mean, everyone got to work early that day.
Yeah. But at the same time, there was another report that I mentioned where a woman from the 1990s in Vladivostok, I think it was the Jomar family, they claimed that a ball lightning came in through their window. When the ball lightning exploded, it pushed all their clocks 15 minutes forward. So there's this weird temporal stuff that is connected with this high strangeness activity. And it's funny because what do you have in some of the alien abduction stories? What's really common to these things is missing time. It seems like our sense of time is deeply rooted in all this kind of paranormal phenomena. And I can understand why these agencies would be fascinated to find out why that is.
The Institute.
The Institute.
And how do they know when this stuff's happened? How do they just show up?
I really don't know. And that's part of the question. I mean, maybe they've got some type of technology that is able to do it, or
measuring for an earthquake, but they can measure when there's a time distortion.
Well, that's a possibility. Yeah, that's something that I have heard, speculated upon before, that it's this hidden technology that it's, while they don't understand it, it can give them insight to things that are going on. And that's why they can so rapidly deploy to sites. The other thing that I've heard is simply that it's basically people just start talking like, oh, that's weird, things happened. And because they're talking about over the phones, like the Echelon program, it gets
they're
picked
monitoring
up.
all communications.
It's monitored.
That's probably more reasonable.
Yeah, I mean, they're tentacles into everything, and all of a sudden they'll show up. So, look, they're really fascinating stories, and Paul just does great work in putting all this stuff together. So I'll link to his videos in the show notes at mysteriousuniverse.org over to YouTube so you can watch them for yourself. He's a really underrated researcher. But let's just talk about some of the immortality stuff that I wanted to go into. And this
something about snakes, something about a monastery.
Well, it is.
Something about living forever.
Yeah, it kind of is that. So, I was reading actually just this week where Paul Sieben had a write-up on our site. It's 2,000-year-old bronze Chinese pot contains mysterious liquid. And so what's happened is that this, it's basically the headline, a 2,000-year-old bronze pot has been discovered after it was the revealing. I don't know if it was a tomb or if it was just some type of archaeological dig. No, I'm sorry, it was a tomb. It was a tomb that was built sometime in the Han Dynasty, we believe, which is 202 BC to AD 220. And all we know about it is that they thought that it was alcohol, but analysis of the strange liquid has revealed that it's not alcohol. It seems to be something else. And it's got this image of a bird with a long neck that's on it, and it kind of doubles as a pourer. And it's kind of an odd type of bottle. And scientists aren't entirely sure what it was utilized for and what the liquid inside it is. It's
some kind of Taoist elixir of immortality.
Exactly.
Am I right?
You are right. You are. Well, I think this obviously hasn't been confirmed, but I think you are right. So Jocelyn LeBlanc, who is also a writer for mysteriousuniverse.org, I mean, she does great work as well. She wrote just last year about a mysterious liquid that's been found, wait for it, inside a 2,000-year-old bronze pot. It's believed to be the elixir of life. So archaeologists at that time from central Hainan province actually discovered a tomb that belonged to a Han dynasty family that dates back again to 202 BC. And this elixir was actually recorded in ancient Taoist literature. And so what it was is that at the time, there was this emperor known as Qin Shi Huang, and he was obsessed with finding the elixir of life. And apparently these things were created, these elixirs were created, and they were placed in tombs. Now, 3.5...
Didn't work very well if they're in a tomb.
Maybe. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't.
Oh, you meant to drink it in the afterlife.
Well, I don't know if maybe that's what's going on, but after, back when this, finding came out, the liquid was excavated from the tomb. Archaeologists investigated it. And again, because at first it smelt like alcohol, they thought that's what it was. But when it was analysed, they actually determined that it contained alunite and potassium nitrate. Now, these are two substances that absolutely you really don't want to be drinking, but they're prime ingredients that are described in ancient Taoist texts about the elixir of life. So you have yet another. So it's amazing that they've just unearthed another Han Dynasty tomb.
Yeah, wow.
And these strange pots. Now, of course, what are birds as well? So I remember I said it has this bird with this long neck.
Yeah.
They're symbols of long life. That's what they are. Like these birds, symbols of long life. So when I read that, I thought, yeah, that's pretty fascinating. I want to see if I can find any more details about immortality. And it just so happens that Paul, just through happenstance, as I had a video running in the background, describes one of these stories about a Mongolian monastery that seemingly had some type of elixir of immortality. But before we go into that, I just want to talk about another couple of stories because that's really the coup de grace of the immortality elixirs that you can find. And it's more than that. And the sad thing is that apparently it was destroyed by the Japanese during the Second World War. So this elixir or this incredible, fountain of youth has been lost to us. But before I go into that story, I want to describe to you this story that was uncovered by Paul about an Ivan Efronov. And he was a Soviet paleontologist. Apparently, he had extreme knowledge of history. He had a great understanding of psychology. And allegedly, he was determined by the KGB, again, allegedly, to be an extraterrestrial. So I know that sounds absolutely outrageous, but just bear with me as I describe the story.
What planet was he from?
We don't know where he was from.
Was he Pleiadian?
We don't know where he was from. We don't know what he was doing.
Arcturian?
The guy was a genius on beyond the genius scale. The guy was incredibly brilliant. And apparently he was associated with something known as the Nine Unknown Society. Now, we don't know exactly what the Nine Unknown Society was. Perhaps it was an extraterrestrial group, but I don't even know if he was an extraterrestrial. I think what's being suggested here is that this guy had discovered something that allowed him to be part of a breakaway civilization, which of course would make sense when we're dealing with immortality and some type of elixir of youth or some type of elixir of immortality. So Paul points out that in 1942, 1943, he was an author and he published these, in inverted commas, fiction books about scientific research. And there's this story that relates to a Soviet steamer that had a very strange experience in 1926. Now, what is odd, though, is that this Soviet steamer kind of story lines up with the fact that Ivan actually in 1923 passed exams like with flying colours to become a sea navigator. Like apparently it was a hard thing to do. So he himself was already a sailor. And he describes this story, but it's almost like putting it into fiction. It was a way for him to describe his experiences. But later on we find out that when you go through apparently some of this fiction, which is all written in Russian, obviously, apparently researchers have started pulling out like these little details. It's almost been like a puzzle, and clues to the puzzle have been left inside his literature for people to find details. And this is why there's some belief that this isn't a fiction story at all. This is an event that took place that relates to a secret organization that discovered the elixir of immortality. So in 1926, there was a steamer that was stopped near the Coral Islands. Now, the Coral Islands already have a strange history associated with them. If you recall, many years ago, or maybe not many years ago, but a while back, we were describing the island of Matua and the strange activity that's taking place there. There was also, I think it was Karanov, I can't remember the exact name of it, but there's strange events that, are for another show that are taking place on those islands. But in 1926 with this steamer, the steamer was going along at, average speed, but it struck something it struck the remains of this sunken ship. Now, it was from the 18th century, and it was found to be it was called the St. Anne. So the reason why they knew it was called St. Anne is because they had sent a diver, the first mate and a diver went down to try and help dislodge the ship, because the way that it had gone through, they had to inspect it to see how they could get the ship out. Now, when they dove down to this ship, allegedly they found a bottle that was lying on one of the desks. And this bottle they pulled out, and inside the bottle was the remains of these sealed documents. So once they pulled all these documents out, they started reading through them, and it reveals this story, the story of the captain of the St. Anne, which is this ship that was scuttled. Now, it doesn't reveal exactly, we're not told why the ship was scuttled or what happened. We do know that when the last pages of these documents that were found in this bottle were written, that it happened during the death throes of the captain. But whatever else, we just simply don't know. There are other documents there that describe this incredible story about how they discovered the elixir of youth. And so the story claims is that this captain who wrote this had been engaged in excavation of strange things from the ocean depths. Now, it doesn't say exactly what, but apparently at 17,000 feet, he found some type of crystals that had some type of powers or energy about them.
This is very vague.
We don't know. And it is very vague.
Some kind of crystal.
Well, this is the problem, because allegedly these documents were so badly damaged for being underwater for so long. Even though they were in a sealed bottle, it was damaged. But what's important is the second finding. And the second finding relates to something that happened very close to the location where the steamer struck that vessel, and it happened at 19,000, or a depth of 19,000 feet. So the story goes that 50 men were on board this vessel, and they were exhausted after 4 hours of working the depths. Now, they developed some type of cylinder apparatus that they were using to recover material from the depths. On this particular afternoon, after these 4 hours, the cylinder was brought up, it was swung over the deck, and as it was swung over the deck, it was leaking some type of water. There was water that was coming out from inside it. As it swung over, it smacked an unwitting sailor in the head, causing a massive gash and seemingly killing him. It knocked him over. Now, they immediately stopped with this cylinder, but from the cylinder, water started pouring from it that was coming from the inside of it, and it splashed the wound that was on the head of this sailor. So they all rushed over to this sailor to see this huge gaseous wound. I mean, the guy was essentially dead, but he was still breathing. And they thought, well, he's going to be in trouble. So they take him into a cabin, they lay him down, and while they inspect him and check on him, there's nothing they can do, so they leave him. The following day, the guy gets up, starts wandering around the vessel. There's no gash in his head. He's just complaining about having a headache. But seemingly, the water, whatever had struck him, had some type of special properties. Now, immediately, allegedly, the captain notices this. Like, he notices that there's something about that water, and it was because the water wasn't clear. The water was this blue-grey color. He measured the specific density of it, and he found that it was much higher than the surrounding seawater, which already the specific gravity, of seawater is pretty high anyway. But this must have meant that at 19,000 feet, because it had a higher density, it would have been sitting there. So you can have water within water. So it was just sitting there. So when they put the capsule down and were trying to recover whatever they recovered this stuff that was sitting at this well, and it was. He reports in his notes that they recovered the water from this depression. And so what happened was rumors started spreading about the vessel. This was some type of curative of water. So one of the sailors who had a gash in his hand that was infected comes in and says, I want you to put it on that. And he does. He dabs it in a rag and he dabs it on the sailor. The following day, his wound is healed. It's gone. So the captain takes this bottle and takes the bottle and fills it up with this special water and decides that he's going to keep it for analysis. But he accidentally gets some in his mouth. But it was almost
accidentally.
It was almost like methamphetamine for him. He said he was full of vitality. He was overwhelmed with this happiness, but it wasn't like it was euphoria. It wasn't like a drug. It was just that he had confidence and vitality, and this water seemed to have some type of special ability.
He felt like he was 20, basically.
Pretty much. So what's kind of implied in this story is that the reason why they got scuttled is because they'd gone back to this location to recover more of this water. And unfortunately, something had happened. Something took place which caused them to sink, and that was the end of it. But there's a little detail that comes out. A few years later, that first mate who was on board that steamer ends up in South Africa, of all places. And he ends up in this bar. And the coincidence in this story is strange, but we often know that coincidences, this is why they're called synchronicities, because they seem to have importance. It doesn't seem to be important at the time, but then you realize that there's some connection about it. He walks into this bar and there's this stunning young woman who is singing. Now, this woman who's singing, her name is Anne Jesselton. Now, what we find out is that the captain of this vessel that was scuttled was a Captain Jesselton. There's this Anne. Now, he doesn't think anything of it at first, but he's sitting there and he's just drinking his drink because he's just doing his job. He's drinking his drink, and as he's drinking his drink, he's just listening to the words of the music. And this woman's singing about the elixir of youth and finding the elixir of youth, and and she's giving all this information about it, and it hits him like a ton of bricks. And he goes, Anne, St. Anne, that vessel, Jesselton, oh my God. So he waits for her to finish a set. And she comes and sits down and he approaches her and he says, look, this might seem really unusual, but do you know anything about, Captain Jesselton? Do you know anything about the St. Anne? And apparently she gets really angry. According to the story, she gets really angry and she gets very unfriendly and she doesn't give any clear answers and she gets up and walks away. Now, he thinks that's odd, but maybe it's just, he's asking crazy questions, so that's kind of a typical response. Allegedly, again, according to the story, 4 hours after he departs, this radiogram comes through. And the radiogram is addressed to the captain of the vessel because she must have thought that he was the captain, but he wasn't. He was the first mate. And the captain comes over to this first mate and he says to him, I think this must be for you. Are you at a bar? And he's like, yeah. And the letter, or the radiogram, or a telegram, whatever it was, says to him, I'm so sorry about the way that I treated you yesterday. We really must meet. When you come back, please look for me. But he never went back. But what we find out later on, and this is the incredible thing, is that apparently he realized, because he thought that maybe she was the daughter or something else. She was his wife. She was his wife from the 1800s.
What?
And yet she was young, stunning, and beautiful.
She had the elixir.
Allegedly, she had, and I know I keep on using that word a lot because this is what this entire story is, but she had the elixir. So before his death, the guy that wrote these fictional stories in September of 1972, he started speaking about heavy water with special properties that comes from the bottom of the sea. This actually suggests that that story wasn't fiction at all, that he had details and he was the one that was the first mate, because we never find out the name of the first mate. Apparently it was him. He was the one that had these experiences, but because of fear, perhaps ridicule, and uncovering these details of this group that might have it, that's why he wrote it in the form of fiction, to get the story out there.
I wonder how much you need to drink to stay young forever. Is it just a little thimble in the morning?
Yeah. Do you have to keep on? Yeah. Is it like that movie Death Becomes Her? You just take it once and you're fine until, you end up pulverized?
It's like a glass of orange juice gives you 1,000 years.
Yeah. It's an incredible story. But yeah, apparently the other thing that's really fascinating about this guy is Paul says that whoever reads his novels, it has a really positive emotional healing effect on people. It's really strange. And Paul is imploring other researchers, to go and try and find out more details about this guy, because he thinks that hidden within as I said, it's like all these hidden messages and puzzles are inside his fictional writings, where we'll actually, he's purposely hidden the message, so that one day someone will be able to decipher it and actually get the truth out of it. So there's too many questions in these stories, but I think stories like that are just simply amazing. And, Paul goes on to speculate that there is this group that has access to this elixir, and they exist, and we just simply will never know. Apparently, with this group, they had, what was found with them? I can't remember exactly what it was, but apparently one of the group came forward and started giving details of census records, and found that every single person that was listed was at least 144 years old. One of the whistleblowers that had come out from this group, but further details are not included, sadly. But while we're on the topic of immortality, I want to finish this story, or finish the show with this story of the Mongolian monastery of immortality.
I've been waiting for this moment since 8 o'clock this morning when I got up.
This is a really amazing story that I absolutely love. So this relates to the Gobi Desert. And we don't have a lot of detail about it, but allegedly it relates to a man by the name of Rudinensky. And he was an employee of the secret Soviet police. And again, one of these people that's in the know, one of these people that has information, but eventually comes out with the details of what they were involved with, because there's no one to punish them anymore. The Soviet Union collapsed. So it's almost like, well, what are you going to do about it? So apparently he was a world-renowned physician of some kind. Like, he was a very, very intelligent man. But he essentially went to Mongolia. And when he went to Mongolia, he was ordained. Like, he was actually ordained by the Mongolian priests, and he followed through this very difficult process and ritual to become ordained and be accepted in by the Mongolian people, and especially by these priests and these spiritual people. And when he was taken in, he was then told that he was going to be taken to the monastery of immortality. And he just thought that was kind of just a term that was being used. It was just this thing. So he was taken deep into the Gobi Desert, and he comes to this spectacular monastery, a location that just simply shouldn't exist. It was huge. It was ornately decorated. It was beautiful. But as he comes up these many stairs, there's this, and you can imagine, you can see it out of these movies. He walks up these long stairs that seem to meander around but have purpose to them, and it's a very sacred location. You can feel it just coming off the entire site, and he's feeling, that he's, there's a sense of
reverence.
Yeah, there's a reverence that's coming from this place. And so he gets up, and when he gets up to the interior, he finds that he's sitting upon this massive flat rock. And inside this flat rock is a carving of the human form. It's like pools. It's about 50 meters long. And these pools are separated. So you have a pool for the head, you have a pool for the arms and for the legs. And between them are these stone pipes of these flowing hot mineral springs. And he's looking, and he sees people like these, unfortunately, poor decrepit people that have been brought to this monastery. And he watches as this poor guy seemed to have a leg injury of some kind walks over to this form of this human form into the leg pool. And he disrobes and he's taken into the leg pool, and he watches. And he claims that as he watches this man descend into these bubbling waters, it's not boiling obviously, but it's extremely hot. He says these snakes appear. These snakes all seem to come out of the pipes that are in there, coming out of these mineral pipes, and entwine him. They start wrapping themselves around this man. They don't bite. They're not aggressive.
They're actual live snakes.
They're live snakes, but he says they're not like any snake I've ever seen. They're not like any snake I've ever seen. But they're snakes. Like, they seem to be this form, but they seem to be embracing this man. And they embrace the man, and the man sits there in this joyous kind of look on his face, and the snakes seem to entwine around him.
Is this some kind of Japanese tentacle porn you're doing right now? Like, you're just sneaking it into this old story?
No. They're snakes. They're not octopus. So essentially the snakes then leave, and this man springs out of this water. He springs out of the pool. This crippled leg he had is gone. His leg has returned to normal, and he appears to be younger. He is just bathed in this immortal pool. And he leaves, and more men come through, and he watches the entire thing. Now, he says that the monks, he learns that the monks, it's a long sacred location that's been there for a very long time. And these monks that are there, their role is to not only look after the waters, but essentially they're caretakers for these snakes. And he says they feed them with these strange foods. He says he's never seen it before, but it's this odd kind of colored food that he doesn't know what it is. And they feed it to the snakes, and the snakes seem to be happy. And there's this, reciprocity between the snakes and the monks. Now, the really sad thing about this, and this is what's so horrible, I don't know if it was him. I don't think it was him that revealed this location, but somehow through either counterintelligence or something like that, the Japanese find out about the precise location of this monastery. And according to the story, the Japanese went to the site. They removed all the water from it. They stole the water. They killed the snakes. They killed the monks, and they filled everything in and
Why
took
would
it.
you kill the snakes? They're
Exactly.
the key to the whole thing.
And they took up, well, the water in itself has abilities as well. But what we find out later on, according to the report, is that the snakes actually secreted some specialized enzymes that had extraordinary healing abilities.
What do the snakes get out of it? Are they like those little Thai fish that get all the dead skin off your feet?
Yeah, well, they're being fed by the monks. And they continue to live in their environment that they're obviously very comfortable and adapted for. I mean,
so they're trained. These magical snakes are trained to come out of the pipes and then go to a human body and throw up on the human body.
Yeah, pretty much.
With their magical secretion powers.
Yeah.
And then when they're finished, they just swim back up the pipe.
Swim away, they get fed, and then off they go.
Right.
Just like...
So I've got to put that up there with the story of the guy that traveled to Tibet and ventured down into the vampire kingdom.
I forgot about that, yes.
And when he was asked how he got to Tibet, there were press photos of him with a rubber dinghy on the River Thames, who's rowing his way to Tibet.
Look, I know that, yes, absolutely. I mean, these stories all, really are on the limits of believability, but I think they're fun, and I think they're something that we should talk about because there's a lot of history with these things. I mean, there's so many. There was another story, actually, that was really amazing that I'll just briefly mention. But again, it relates to the Japanese because, Unit 731, which was the biological weapons program that was conducted by the Japanese Imperial Army in Manchuria and throughout China and other locations as well, was horrible. Like, it was an absolutely abhorrent. I mean, I absolutely love Japanese culture, but that's a really bad blight on their history because what they did is they basically got fleas. They got plague-infected fleas and then just dropped them in ceramic bombs all over in little villages to see what would happen if they could disperse plague and use it as a biological weapon. And there was this one particular city in China, I don't know exactly where it was, but this biological weapons testing took place secretly. They didn't know that the Japanese were deploying these, flea-ridden plague bombs. And when it infected people, the Chinese at the time erected a special hospital, but there wasn't much that they could do. I mean, there was this terrible plague outbreak, antibiotics that only just really were in their infancy. There wasn't much that they could do. But oddly enough, at this particular hospital, this strange Mongolian man, this elderly Mongolian man, just appears from nowhere bearing these odd grasses or herbs. Now, he goes into this hospital and he starts giving these herbs, just very small amounts, to each of the patients that's inside this special hospital suffering from plague. I mean, plague is a terrible disease once you've got it. Yersinia pestis, it's a terrible bacteria. And this is why it's called plague. It causes you to, go gangrenous from the inside. You get black, marks coming up on you. It's horrible. But miraculously, 120 people were cured after this Mongolian man appeared, right? So one of the people that was at this site, this is where the story comes from, who was cured by him in these herbs, goes up to him and asks him, "Where are you from? What have you given me? How did you do that?" And he describes, he says, "Look, my entire family died of the plague, and I was led by these monks to this location where there were these herbs. And these herbs and these grasses in this particular field had these special healing properties because it was fed by a river that came from a special monastery." So we don't know exactly if it's connected to the monastery I was just describing, but it seems like the water does flow. And the Chinese even have stories. Apparently, the Chinese have stories of another location where the plants would grow and they would have these odd trees, and the odd trees would have yellow flowers with red fruit. And it was being serviced by this, essentially the elixir of immortality water. This is how the trees were growing, how they were being irrigated. And if you ate this fruit, it would cause healings. You would somehow miraculously recover from things by eating this fruit, but no one worked out it was coming from the water. So the sad part is, again, in this story, is much like the monastery that was destroyed, right after this old man showed up, the Japanese killed him after he cured 120 people.
Oh.
Rather than finding his, the secret of whatever he discovered.
Seems like a rash decision.
Well, look, it was the war, and, terrible things all took place at the time. So
it actually reminds me of stories we've covered on the show before. I'm not sure if it's from Grail legends of coming to various places in England and establishing a basic kind of monastery based on harmonic geometry.
Oh, yes.
And this would create fertility in the land, which would lead to, flowering of fruits and just everything would magically be growing perfectly. And, the rivers would be flowing with healing water. And there's similar stories throughout the world.
Yeah, and it's funny because it's kind of similar to what we were talking about with the crop circles, that you could utilize energies to cause things to grow better. Maybe it's the same. It's like some type of the geometry or activating, and I know it sounds very new agey, but it's the only way I can describe it, like activating the geometry of an area somehow. You can infuse the waters with some type of special properties that do these things that, allow the extension of life. And yeah, as I said, ultimately, from the research that Paul put together, there is some suspicion that there is a breakaway group of people that are extremely old, but it's because they discovered the elixir of youth a very, very long time ago.
And the good news for you listening at home, we have acquired some of the strange goop from the device, and it will be available in the Mysterious Universe store from tomorrow.
You know what? That's a really great idea. Why don't we just start selling bathwater, Ben? I think that's a really good idea. It's infused with Grundy enzymes.
Yeah, buy some of the life-enhancing goop and get a free bottle of Aaron's bathwater.
Look, the thing about this is that, like, I know on the show, like, what I really want to do is the whole way that I approach my work on the show is that I cover stories that are allegedly true. And every single one of these stories are allegedly true. But look, I'm not going to, listen to me, I'm not going to say that I believe them and in this circumstance, and I'm not going to say that I am going to completely indulge in them. But I think they're fun to discuss, and I think that, you know, we should see if we can find these, because sometimes in the future, if they match up with another story, you start getting some verification.
That's what I like about what you do. You seem to find connections across all these different tales.
Well, because there are. You know, they really are. And that's what I think. Yeah, some stories might be bunk and some stories might be really outrageous. But sometimes, you know, you find that diamond in the rough where you find that, hang on a second, you know, that ties in with a story that we've discussed years ago.
Well, let me set the scene for what's coming up in the Plus extension in a moment. The new book of Flash Crash, A Trading Savant, A Global Manhunt, and the Most Mysterious Market Crash in History, this brand new book from Liam Vaughan. Essentially, it's April 2015. It's a cold, dark Tuesday morning, and half a dozen plainclothes police, 2 FBI agents, and 2 prosecutors from the US Department of Justice are waiting at a McDonald's in Hounslow on the outskirts of London. This is a mission they've been working on for 2.5 years to capture one of the world's most dangerous and prolific market manipulators. Their target is a 36-year-old Londoner. His name is Navinder Singh Sarao, who made $70 million from nothing in the US futures markets using a variety of controversial methods. It's claimed by the American government he had helped precipitate the most dramatic market collapse in recent history. Now, the Americans, they've been watching him for months, but no one had actually met the guy. No one had actually come across him, you know, in person. They'd been tracing his assets. They'd been interviewing his associates, you know, reading his emails, all that stuff. But he was a bit of an enigma because this massive trading he was doing, $70 million from nothing and causing the greatest crash ever in history, he did it all from his parents' house in Hounslow.
Right.
And he was basically a stranger to Wall Street. This is what's so fascinating about this guy. He didn't tell anyone about anything he was doing. He didn't brag about his money. He didn't spend any of his money. But records showed he routinely placed bigger bets than the world's largest banks and hedge funds, again, from his parents' house in Hounslow.
How could he do that?
Yeah, dude, it's such an insane story. They'd been tracking him from his IP address. They knew he had some kind of, nocturnal existence. I mean, he would wake up at, he'd start trading the markets at 10 p.m. in the US. And he would just stay up till 3 or 4 a.m. every morning. His family would wake up and go to, because they're Sikh. It's a Sikh family. They'll go to their religious thing in the morning. And he would just sleep in all day. But this particular morning, he's woken up at 8. And actually, the police knock on the door and his dad answers the door. Nav is still asleep upstairs. And his dad's like, yeah, what is this about? He has to go upstairs and rouse his son. And he's charged with fraud and market manipulation. He comes down wearing this baggy tracksuit. He's like spiky hair. He's like, well, what's going on? You're being charged for market manipulation. You're under arrest. Now, when the officers go up to his room and search the property, you could expect they might be, thinking they'll find some elite setup with, 10 screens, computers everywhere. But they go into this guy's room and it just looks like any teenager's bedroom, even though he's not a teenager. He's in his mid-30s at this stage in the story.
No, but the bedroom is, stuck in that time.
It's a young man's bedroom. He's got like soccer posters on the wall. His bed's unmade. He's got a full-size cutout of the football player Messi in his room. He's got a little TV and a PlayStation. It's just like how I'd expect an 18-year-old kid's room to look like. And he's just got, at the end of his bed, he's got this dinky little computer with 2 screens, and that's it.
So how did he manage to cause a flash crash?
And from this, he earned $70 million. It is insane. So eventually he's handcuffed and led outside. And as he's leaving, he says to one of the officers, hey, bruv, can you let me tape a football match tonight? I want to watch this football match. Like, he's so completely disconnected from the trouble that he's in. He wants to go and tape a soccer match that's on that night. And the police officer's like, I don't know if you're going to be back in time to watch the match. I don't know if you understand what's going on.
I don't know if 20 years will really be much time.
Well, the officer was right, because he wouldn't set foot back in his home for another 4 months. By then, he would be known around the world as the flash crash trader, the hound of Hounslow, the scourge of the markets, or a modern-day folk hero, depending on whom you asked.
Did he manage to keep his $70 million?
Well, that afternoon, after he had been arrested, the Department of Justice and the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, that looks after this particular aspect of financial trading, they immediately sent out a press release. And it said a futures trader was arrested in the UK today on US wire fraud and commodities fraud and manipulation charges in connection with his alleged role in the May 2010 flash crash. Sorrell used an automated trading program to manipulate the market, it said, earning significant profits and contributing to a major drop in the US stock market. Now, the announcements were shocking and really actually bizarre, because that flash crash, like I was describing at the start of the show, that half hour collapsed markets all around the world. Like I said, stock was trading for 0.00001 cent that was worth $50 minutes earlier.
God, could you imagine though if people had stop losses in, it would have triggered all that?
Well, there were people that lost their retirement funds. There were traders that lost $8 million in 10 minutes of their personal money. Like, it just ruined so many lives. But it had occurred 5 years ago, and no one had really understood what was behind it. And now, seemingly out of the blue, the Department of Justice is saying, here's this lone wolf guy in his parents' house in London, and he caused the whole thing. And you're just like, what? People at the time are thinking, what are you talking about? I mean, first of all, the biggest question that comes to mind is, what does this say about the stability of the modern global financial system?
It's tinkering on the edge, Ben.
If this guy, from his PC and internet connection, can wreak this havoc. So when we come back after the break, we'll look at the story in more detail. We'll find out what was behind it. And it's such a fascinating read from Liam Vaughan, because he's covering a really complex area of finance. Like, there's a lot of stuff that, he's talking about how trades are made and trading futures and all the details of how this guy did it. But he stops and, in very easy to understand layman's terms, explains what's going on.
Did I just say tinkering on the edge? I meant teetering on the edge. Sorry about that.
He was tinkering.
Well, that's what I was imagining. It's like just tinkering away his computer, destroying the system.
He was kind of tinkering. So it's such an amazing story. We'll go into it for our Plus members after the break. If you want to sign up for Plus, head to mysteriousuniverse.org/Plus. All the details are there. You get access to these extensions we do every single Friday. And of course, we do the exclusive shows for Plus members on Tuesdays as well. You're getting more than double the content if you sign up for Plus. And you also get a higher bitrate feed too. So Plus members get a higher quality audio version of the show, the best sounding show we put out. You get an ad-free experience if you're on Plus. All the features of our apps are unlocked as well. And if you're a Plus member, you can log on to your dashboard on the desktop version of our site, and there's a discount code you can use on our store for 15% off digital products. Sign up today, mysteriousuniverse.org/plus. Help support your favorite show. And that's a wrap for this free edition of MU. Thanks for listening. More on the flash crash coming up after the break. If you're on Plus, stick around for that. For everyone else, we'll catch you next week.
I don't even know what I want no more, yeah. I'ma figure out what to do with all my time, my new life, yeah. I don't even know what to do right now, yeah. I'ma figure out what to do with all my time, my new life, yeah. I don't wanna try again. I don't wanna try again. Felt this coming. Can we just leave it right here, never to touch it again? Yeah, even
Welcome back to your Plus Extension. Great to have you.